a very warm welcome once again. And we have 5 distinguished panelists with us. So I will introduce our panelists first. We have Dr. Geeta Gandhi Kingdon with us. She represents City Montessori School, Lucknow. She's also a part-time professor at the UCL Institute of Education, University College, London, where she holds the Chair of Education and International Development. Prior to this, she worked for 10 years at the Department of Economics, University of Oxford. Her research is based mostly on statistical analysis of education data sets. She has investigated school effectiveness, gender in education, labor market outcomes of education, and the political economy of education. Based on this research, she advises governments and donor agencies such as the World Bank, European Union, and the UK's Department for International Development DFID on their education-related aid to developing countries. Our second panelist, Ms. Madhuri Dhariwal, she's serving Indus Action as a senior lead. She's a mentor to the Chhattisgarh PMU and leads the strategy and learning team. She has done MEd in International Education Policy from Harvard Graduate School of Education, 2016, and has 9 years of experience in the social development sector. Madhuri is an educator and a policy enthusiast. She believes in systems reform and is ensuring access to quality education, healthcare, nutrition for every citizen. Her past areas of experience include teaching, coding, consulting, work on diversity, gender, and inclusion, among others. She's worked extensively with children and believes in the power of arts to convey ideas. Our third panelist is Mr. Amit Kaushik. Mr. Kaushik is the CEO of Acer India. He has considerable experience across a range of government, NGO, and private organizations. He has worked in the Ministry of Human Resource Development, for the SRF and Pratham Education Foundation, and for EduComp Infrastructure and School Management Limited. He's also been the head of the Education and Skills Development for IP Global Limited. Welcome, Mr. Kaushik. Our next panelist is Mr. Sushil Dhankar, who is the chairman of Hari Vidya Bhavan Senior Secondary School in New Delhi and a member of the National Independent School Alliance, NISA, which is a network of nearly 60,000 budget private schools across India. Our next panelist is Mr. Anurag Kundu. He has been the chairperson of Delhi Commission for Protection of Child Rights, DCPCR, Government of NCT of Delhi, which is a position equivalent to Joint Secretary Government of India since July 2020. As chairperson, he is responsible for monitoring the implementation of the rights of the children, commission research studies, inquire into specific complaints or violation of rights, and advise the government on policy matters on the issue of early childhood care and development, school education. Mr. Kundu has wide experience of working on children's issues with a particular focus on education issues, and he has been advising the government of NCT of Delhi since 2015. Prior to joining DCPCR as chairperson, he served as member DCPCR, where he headed the education division. He was responsible for monitoring the implementation of the Right to Education Act across 5,500 government, municipal, and private schools. So welcome to all the panelists. How we are going to go about it is that I will ask one question to each of the panelists, and you can take up to 5 to 7 minutes so that we have some time, maybe 15 to 20 minutes for audience questions. And I request the audience, they can submit their questions, they can put their questions in the question box. And our team will select the questions, and then we can take questions in the last 15 minutes with the panelists. So my first question is for Madhuri. Madhuri, how well has Section 12 of the Right to Education Act served its purpose of inclusive education? Are there cases where its implementation has actually defeated the purpose?
Thanks, Prashant. Hi, everyone. So, as we've all heard of the context of what Section 12(1)(c) is about, and we're all aware of the larger intent that the policy was to serve, is to ensure that that there is one school choice in terms of where parents send their children, and that their circumstances of birth are not the limiting factor for where children can study. And the second more overarching objective of the policy in itself and the act was to ensure that the society that we're living in becomes more inclusive as we move along, because when children from different backgrounds engage with each other at such close quarters, when they are studying together from childhood, that is when the society that they grow up to become is going to be more inclusive. And so that's the premise based on which, the policy and the act was instituted. And what we've seen in the past in the implementation in India right now, 17 states and UTs are implementing Section 12(1)(c). And there's over 40 lakh students who have taken admission under the policy up until 2019. Numbers for 20 and 21 are still coming up. One of the things that one example, and as you guys were mentioning earlier, that you've studied certain High Court and Supreme Court judgments to see where these are, what is happening on the legal side of it. One of those is a judgment in Karnataka, where they've adopted Rule 7, which is the amendment made to the policy in itself, which we feel has defeated the purpose of implementing Section 12(1)(c) particularly. So the clause there states that if there's a government school around in that neighborhood where children are, then the seats in the government school should be filled up first before children can take admission in a private school. And that is one such example where I feel that, the implementation has defeated the purpose of the act of ensuring that there is choice and that there is inclusion. If I talk about the overall larger context, we are seeing that the policy in itself has removed privileged access to quality education because it is diluting social, financial, and psychological barriers. So we conducted retention surveys across some of the states where intersection works. And we found that there is a 77%, in 2019, there was 77% retention of students in the states of Delhi, Chhattisgarh, Tamil Nadu, and Uttarakhand. And we conducted a similar survey this year. The report isn't out yet, but we found almost 90% retention rates in children who've enrolled under Section 12(1)(c), even in a pandemic year. So there, this gives us hope to the fact that, children are thriving, they are surviving, and retention is after 2 years of being enrolled is what we're trying to check for retention. So they are surviving and thriving there. There haven't been many studies done in terms of learning outcomes for children or longitudinal studies that showcase children who've completed this cycle. And the first batch passed out only 2 years ago from 8th standard. So there haven't been many longitudinal studies to actually show what the impact of the policy has been in terms of either retention post 8th standard. So have they managed to stay on, because the policy ends till 8th, except for in Chhattisgarh where they've increased it till 12th. And the second thing being, after they've accomplished, once they've passed out of school, is there any implication on their livelihoods, on their family, and how they're moving forward with it? So those are pieces which haven't been studied as much. And that's an area which definitely requires more research out there. Yeah. So that, I think, I'll conclude with that there are inclusive education. I think there is more to be discussed and studied around what the actual how inclusive are schools. We've only heard and seen more anecdotal evidences rather than a very concrete evidence of either side, of whether it is inclusive or not. So there are anecdotal evidences of both. And so there's definitely more research required on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhuri. Sushilji, I will come to you next. What has been your experience since your school is a budget private school in Delhi? How has been your experience in last 10 years with reimbursements?
You're muted.
Sushilji, you are on mute.
I'm sorry.
Haan ji.
Hi, Praveenji. Hi, everyone. To start with, I'll tell you, in the beginning, the schools were very reluctant in taking admissions of EWS and DG category. But slowly by 2014, every school accepted that, now 20% seats are reserved for EWS and DG students. But the main problem which we face is reimbursement. We don't know when we will be reimbursed. I'll give you a very small example. Like Delhi government has fixed 1100 rupees for uniform for the entire session. So can you imagine, can you buy 2 pair of summer uniform and 2 pair of, winter uniform along with a blazer and a sweater in 1100 rupees? In any market you go, you cannot buy. So that's why Delhi government receives complaints from parents, and DCPCR Anurag Kunduji is there. He knows how many complaints he receives during the admission time. That schools are not providing uniform, schools are not providing books, schools are not providing copies. So reimbursement is being delayed with not actual cost. That's why parents are being harassed. It's not the government, who's facing problem. It's not the schools who are facing problem. Ultimately, the parents and the students are facing the problem. After, either the school, what school does is they take the they charge actual amount from the parents minus the amount which the government is reimbursing. So parents have to pay some kind of amount to the school to cover those actual expenses. Now the parents run to the government offices and they file a complaint against the school. So it takes around 5 to 6 days for them to file a complaint. Then they don't know how to file a complaint online. They find someone to file their complaint online. So now it's the parents who's being harassed. My belief is that if the government wants this act to be implemented in a true spirit, the schools should be reimbursed their actual cost which they are incurring. Either it's books, uniform, copies, or anything, annual charges. They should not be capping the amount, because there are a lot of elite schools, also private schools, where they have a lot of staff, they have good infrastructure, where these EWS and DG category students can get good exposure. But because of the reimbursement amount, delayed amount, I'll tell you, we have not received session 2021 amount till now, right? So we are expecting it. We don't know when we will be getting. We also don't know how it is how they calculate this reimbursement amount. So we believe that government should actually give actual cost which the schools incur on the education of EWS DG category to implement this act in a true spirit. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sushilji. Sushilji, one small question. Could you tell us what sort of amount, what is the ideal amount according to you? What amount are you looking at?
I mean, no amount is ideal amount. Whatever maybe I can buy the uniform, for the EWS DG category students for 2,000 rupees. Other school maybe can buy for 2,400 rupees. And the uniform amount, books amount is not fixed. So there is no ideal amount. Government should take the bills, whatever the bills are, they should reimburse the same. I'll tell you one more thing. This year, government fixed the books and copies and writing material amount. Can you imagine a primary class? The books price was capped for 250 rupees or 300 maybe. So what parents did this session was, or what school did? School started charging from the parents. And there was an enormous number of complaints which the government department, which the education department received from parents, and they had to roll back the amount. So, till the time you don't get, the school would not get the actual amount. It would be very difficult to, to implement this act in a true spirit.
Thank you, Sushilji. My next question is for Geeta. Professor Kingdon, there was a recent Supreme Court order. Actually, it has come from the Delhi High Court. Delhi High Court had passed a judgment last year that suggested the inclusion of gadgets and internet package cost under Section 12(2). So in the past as well, we have seen other high courts widening the ambit of Section 12(2). For example, some high courts have said that, books and uniforms. Some high court have said pre-primary is to be included. Bombay High Court said secondary also is to be included. So secondary classes also to be included. Now, although, these judgments makes the provision more inclusive, but it ends up hurting the private schools as reimbursements. As Sushilji also said, it's either inadequate or delayed, or sometimes there are no reimbursements. So what is your thought, how this contradiction can be resolved?
Well, I'll just make some more general comments first, if I may, and then I'll come to this hopefully. The intent of the Section 12(1)(c) of the RTA Act is to, include the more disadvantaged, the economically weaker section children in better education, good quality education. And the fact that this Section 12(1)(c) has come in is a kind of a tacit acceptance of the idea that private schools are providing education that is of somehow, good quality, that even disadvantaged children should have access to. And I think the intent is to create a kind of a public-private partnership, though they never say that anywhere. But in fact, it is private sector delivery of publicly funded education. That is what the intent was. So the publicly funded part was going to be the reimbursement part. The formula that was given in most of the states, there's no calculation made of the per pupil expenditure in the government schooling system. It's not been notified through the Gazette. In Tamil Nadu, it was notified as to what it is. And Delhi government has come out with a government order. Each time it revises the reimbursement rate. However, in every single state, there is a discrepancy between the actual per pupil expenditure and the reimbursement amount. And now the upper end of the reimbursement amount, the upper limit of it. So for example, Delhi, if you look at the economic survey of Delhi, which the government itself brings out, it shows in 2019-20 per pupil expenditure by the government on elementary schools of about 5,500 rupees per month per child. It's about 64,000 rupees for the year 2019-20. But the reimbursement amount, as far as I can tell, is something like 2,250 rupees per month. That is the upper limit of what the government shall reimburse. So even when the government has notified, at least Delhi government is explicitly notifying what is the reimbursement amount is going to be, but that reimbursement amount is not as per the act. And that's just one example. Other states have given an arbitrary number. For example, Uttar Pradesh has declared in June 2013, that the reimbursement amount will be 450 rupees per month per child. There is no effort even to try and relate it to the per pupil expenditure. You can put RTI queries, you can go to court. The courts are often delaying listening to these cases, which are seemingly cut and dried, because it's absolutely in violation of the statute to not calculate the per pupil expenditure in the state government schools. Now, there are technical problems in calculating that. The fundamental problem, in my view, is that the formula for the calculation of the per pupil expenditure in the government schooling system that is being given is in itself problematic, and that is why state governments are not calculating it. And I think the problem is this, that you see, first of all, what we see as the prima facie enrollment amount, the number of students enrolled, we know that there's fake enrollments, there's overstated and exaggerated enrollments. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is that, the number of pupils in government schools has been falling continuously, monotonically. That number has been falling. I've been following that from the year 2010 onwards. And so what happens is that the denominator is falling, and therefore the per pupil expenditure on each child is increasing, you know. So the government doesn't want to pick up the tabs of that. It's like a penalty on the government for the fact for the reimbursement amount having to be given to the private schools being higher simply because children are abandoning government schools. And this is where I wanted to comment on what Madhuri was saying, that, you know, that the idea that, you know, Section 12(1)(c) was meant to give children the choice, but certain state governments have said that, look, children can opt for private schools only if the local government school is full, and that deprives children of the choice of going to a private school. The problem, of course, is that if the government allowed that choice, then the speed of emptying of government schools would be massive, even more dramatic than what it is already at the moment. So people would abandon government schools, so the government schools infrastructure, the number of teachers that they've appointed, the salaries that they give, they would all become you know, even more hollowed out, and the per pupil expenditure would rise even more. So it's a vicious cycle. And this is a fundamental problem why the whole thing collapses, why the system itself is set up in such a way that it is fundamentally flawed. The calculation formula is flawed. If they were to give the choice, then this would be the consequence, the horrific consequence of giving that choice. So I think that there are inherent discrepancies in it. There are many, many other problems. For example, you know, I don't think people have mentioned so far the fake schools, the fake enrollments that are being said in this. You know, there are so many articles. The Comptroller and Auditor General itself has done a survey of the malpractices in the reimbursements by government officials as well. So, you know, government officials seeking to make money out of it. And they actually say, you know, the CAG report, the Comptroller and Auditor General's report, it talks about quite openly about, you know, massive scale of corruption. It uses the word massive scale. So I think that, you know, these are some of the really important problems. Now, one other really important problem is this, with this section, that, you know, well, it's not so much with this section, but more with the Act, apart from this, its input focus, which the new education policy recognizes that was, you know, the new education policy draft in 2019 has a whole section which sort of reviews the Act, the Section 12(1)(c) of the Act, and it highlights some of the problems that it perceives with the Act. It talks about the problem of corruption as well. It talks about the fact that it's only applicable to the minority. It excludes the minority schools, and so on and so forth. But I think one, you know, other problem is that it, you know, the intent of the Act is to shore up children's right to education, that every child should have the right to education. First of all, this Act was brought in at a time when, if you look at the ASER data of that year, 2009 or 10, primary school, elementary school enrollment was already 96.5%. So children's right to education was almost, you know, fully sort of assured anyway, in the sense that most of the children were in school. So what was the need for this Act? So that one could perhaps raise that question. Secondly, the intent of the Act is to shore up the right of children to elementary education, but its effect in some of the states in some ways has been quite the opposite, because in the name of those inputs that all the schools had to show that they had, many private unaided schools, budget private unaided schools, low fee private unaided schools were compelled to close down. And there was no provision in those letters ordering the closure of these budget private schools. It didn't say, it just said that you are required to close your school forthwith, immediately. And, you know, within 3 days, you are to admit your children in other local schools. It didn't say whether the government was not undertaking to assure that there were other local schools which had capacity or any of those things. So it left very much, you know, to chance whether the children would in fact be accommodated. So there was the CCS has done a study on the number of private unaided schools that closed down. So there are many other points that one can make. Now to come to the point that Prashant, you were asking about, sorry, yours was about the court case to do with, could you just remind me? Sorry.
Yeah, so it's about covering many other expenses. So for example, books, uniform, and the latest judgment by Delhi High Court was that digital devices and internet package also to be included. But the question is, who will pay for it?
Well, I mean, what I've heard anecdotally is that the parents of the other children are coming forward and they are feeling bad that their children have these devices and have internet access, and the children who are RTE children in the same class and section do not have that. So oftentimes the parents of the other children are coming forward and doing that, but that was not the intent of the act. The intent of the act was to provide, to compensate the school for educating these children. And this goes to the point that Mr. Sushil Dhankar was making, that, what should be included in it. I mean, this is as you said, Prashant, that different courts are giving different interpretations of what is includable. For example, the inclusion of children in grades 9, 10, 11, and 12 under the RT Act seems totally, ultra vires, because if you look at the provisions of the act is being made in pursuance of the Constitution of India, which itself was amended to fix 6 years as the lower limit. And yet most of the children that are being sent for admission under the act are aged below 6. They're aged 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. So that's one issue. Secondly, the Constitution guarantees education for persons of the age of 6 to 14 years. So if a child of 14 years or 13 years is studying in grade 9 or 10 or 11 or 12, then that's okay. Then they are covered. Then they indeed are entitled to it. But if not, then where is this entitlement coming from? I'm talking now from a legalistic point of view. I'm not saying that that's not desirable. But the point is that as a nation, we've not decided that yet, and certainly is not a part of the statute.
Yeah, it's not part of the statute and it's not part of the Constitution.
Absolutely. The statute derives its raison d'etre, its justification for its existence from Article 21A of the Constitution that guarantees the right to education of persons of age 6 to 14.
That's right. Thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Kindle. Thank you. Mr. Kundo, my next question is to you. How do we change union and state relations to allow a move towards inclusive education? So what are the issues that exist between state governments and the union regarding financing of inclusive education, and how do we address some of these issues?
At least as far as that question is concerned, a very brief and a simplistic answer. Union of India has no business to be in education. It is a concurrent subject for the last 3-4 decades now. But the primary responsibility of delivering education lies with the state government, because by and large, almost 98-99% of schools are either administered or aided or regulated by the respective state government or the local bodies. Personally, I don't know what business does Union of India have in subjects that it has no sort of business in. But can I, for a while, set aside the question and revert to some of the extremely important points made by early Dr. Geeta and everyone else on the panel.
Sure.
There are two parts to the methodology of how the reimbursement is calculated, or the per child expenditure is calculated. One part is where we disagree about the very provision of the statute, which talks about per child expenditure in the government schools. Let me for a minute take that. If we fundamentally disagree with the very provision of the statute, then till date, in about 10 odd years, we have not presented, and when I say we, I very sincerely include all of us and everybody else in the stakeholder, and I'm as guilty as I'm charging the others, that we have not presented a workable alternative model for calculation of reimbursement amount, if not what is provided for by the statute. So until we can provide a workable mechanism, alternative workable mechanism, our criticism of the existing provision statute will have limiting effect. Is a foundational point. Now, if we simply take the provision of the statute and seek to implement it in the letter and the spirit that it was envisaged to be, few points that I have. And here, let's, again, two parts. One is the principle or the methodology laid out in the statute. Two, if it is applied correctly. So there are two parts to it, because the principle or the methodology will still be correct, or acceptable, but the application of it may be arbitrary, discriminatory, opaque, or just wrong. So let me try and break down those into two different parts. And let's first come to the principle or the methodology. We have been boggled by this question ourselves, and therefore we set up an expert committee, and I'm going to put the blame on Amit. We set up an expert committee, and Amit chaired that expert committee. And in the interest of full integrity and transparency, we got 4 out of 6 people who are external to the government. Imagine 4 out of 6 people and really sharp people on the committee to examine the government's methodology and calculation, the application of the methodology, and made available to this committee all background papers that the committee requested for without an exception. And let me read out to you the para 5.7 of the committee's findings. What does para 5.7 says? The para says, the committee examined the criteria adopted by the Department of Education, Government of NCT of Delhi, and the reimbursement amount arrived at on this basis, and concurs with the principle, methodology, and the relevant calculations made thereunder. Of which now this committee had the Private School Association representative as well. This committee had the activists who argue sometimes for private schools, sometimes for children, and legitimately so, on the panel as well. And a serious researcher from Central Square Foundation as well. And of course, chaired by Amit Kaushik, who has headed a private school, who has been a bureaucrat, a civil servant when the drafting of the RT was taking place, and has now worked in private consulting firms in different capacities. So this is the basic methodology. Now, but where does the problem lie? And here, let me admit a few things. The problem lies in 2 or 3 areas. The government needs to do a lot more in making proactive disclosures of its methodology, proactive disclosures of the background papers, proactive disclosures of the numbers used, and make that available for an independent evaluation by whoever would like to. Since last 1 year, we have made all those papers available, and they are right now on DCPCI website and have been housed there for about 14 to 15 odd months. So you can just go to the DCPCI website and you can find every number there, including file notings scan as well, which led to the sort of, the second problem lies in the other perception, which is what Mr. Dhankar was referring. When we say कि 250 रुपए में कौन सी किताब आएगी या 1150 रुपए में या 1500 रुपए में कौन सी यूनिफॉर्म्स आएंगी, he is absolutely correct. But here is a problem. If 100 रुपए अगर आपके टोटल बनते हैं और मैं उसको अगर अब बाइफरकेट कर दूं कि 91 इस चीज के, 2 रुपए इस चीज के, 3 रुपए इस चीज के, it's if I start bifurcating that, perhaps I may not be able to purchase anything in 2 rupees. See, the government's per child expenditure is one amount. We, and clearly the time has not proven us wise, we chose to show that 100 rupees in bifurcated heads. Now the government, based on the perceptions, charge that, oh, who can buy 250 rupees mein kitab? Correct. But the total amount is exactly what the committee has investigated and found to be correct. And then make all disclosures of the public documents in this regard. So I've not really understood as to, and again, if the foundational concern is a very provision statute, that's a different discussion, and that discussion should be had. But as far as the application of that methodology in the context of Delhi is concerned, there has been a great transparency in this regard. And here is further, let me lay down some of the reasons for delay. And let me right at the outset say, Government of NCT of Delhi is at fault. And let me state it categorically, is at fault in delaying reimbursements to private schools under Section 12(1)(c) of the RTE Act. And I've stated that categorically. And I know we are being recorded. And yet I've stated that. But is a further nuance and depth of it. And again, let me refer to our own analysis of this. We did the analysis of last 3-4 years as to why there was a delay, because we were also tired of listening to this. And here's what we found. 48% schools had not filed their claims. 48% essentially means 1 in 2 schools had not filed their claims in time stipulated. Now, if half the schools are not filing their claims, and the department has had to issue 3 reminders requesting the schools to file their claims, then tell me, can I process a claim that has not been filed? The answer is no, because I need basic access to numbers before I can process your claim. Why haven't the 50% schools filed claims and the government has had to issue 3 reminders? Now, what that does, and it's in that becomes injustice to those half the schools which have filed the claims. Because the government very often tries to complete the process, or at least a significant part of it, before starting to process the claims itself. So that's one area where we found that, which is a significant contributor to the delays itself. The second delay, and Mr. Dhankar was absolutely right when he was referring to, is the very design of the statute. The statute uses the word reimbursement or the expenditure so incurred. Now, what is the implication of the phrase expenditure or reimbursement? The dictionary meaning of reimbursement is that you have to incur the cost first. And again, I am absolutely fine if we disagree with the very provision of the statute. But once the provision is made, the executive is bound to just comply and implement that provision. Now, the reimbursement means you have to incur the cost first, and then the money will flow in. The expenditure so incurred means the government has to incur its expenditure. The expenditure is considered final only when the permission or the approval by the legislature is granted, which is further 6 months. So inbuilt in the design itself is a 1.5 years of delay, because the government has to first incur the expenditure. For example, for the 2021, the government has already incurred the expenditure it had to, and it right now still awaits the approval of the legislature before that expenditure may be considered final. And only when the approval of the legislature comes, which typically happens around the revised estimates, the RE October, November, December, can the government consider its expenditure final and then proceed to calculate the amount. So inherent in the design of the statute is a 1.5 years of delay. No executive can help that. Only the legislature can help that. So just adding a few layer of nuances to the discussion we were having.
This was very helpful, Mr. Kundu. Thank you so much. I'm very tempted to go back to Geeta and Sushilji, but I would hold those questions. I would first go to Mr. Kaushik. Mr. Kaushik, my question to you is, do you envisage any ways, any solutions that would encourage inclusive education, but without limiting the agency of private schools? So is there a way to balance both autonomy and inclusivity?
I think before I address that, let me I've been listening to this conversation with great interest. And I think Anurag has made some very important points, that one is very used to hearing about the issues with the implementation, but actually there are really 2 parts to this whole thing. And when we had met as a committee, we found that the issues were really divided into 3 sort of buckets. One was the entire issue, as he mentioned, of the policy itself, and whether that policy was right or wrong or needed to be changed, and so on. 2 was the operating issues, the implementation issues that Anurag was just discussing, including the fact that from time to time, the fault always does not lie with government. And in fact, I would probably say, having looked at the Delhi process, that Delhi is probably one of the more progressive states when it comes to the entire mechanism that they have in place for calculating and reimbursing the costs that are incurred. And the third bucket was really around those elements that don't fall within this calculation at all. And there have been several such items that have been added on as a result of perhaps court intervention or government decision, executive decisions. So there are those kinds of elements as well. There's a need, I think, to go back to first principles when one looks at policy and to understand what was behind it. Section 12(1)(c) has been a bit of a red herring in my view, in the sense that most attention has been focused there to the detriment of other sections of the RTE Act. And one of the first things that the Act says is that it shall be the duty of the state to provide a school within a certain period of time for all children. That's an aspect that somehow does not get discussed at all. 12(1)(c) was envisaged as a sort of via media to address gaps that might exist in the short term. But those gaps remain unfilled for various reasons. And that's part of, I think, and that's an area where mechanisms like, and Anurag, this is pointed at you, mechanisms like the state commissions for protection of child rights have not sort of paid enough attention to. They should have been looking at what state provisioning was happening instead of only looking at what's happening in the private sector. So that's one part. The other is, I think it's important to sort of, again, recall the background to why 12(1)(c) was introduced. And Dr. Klein referred to good governance in his opening keynote. One of the aspects of good governance is also ensuring that education, which is a public good, is available to all, regardless of birth. You don't get access to good quality education only because you happen to be born in a certain family. And so at the time the bill was being discussed, which was really 2004-05, not even 2009 when it was finally implemented. It was 2004-05. It started from 2002 when the constitutional amendment was passed, but the first real serious draft of the bill was around 2004 and 5. And the view of the CABE committee that looked at that, at the essential provisions that should be captured in this act, was that since the 90s, when economic liberalization began in this country, there'd been a very clear ghettoization of education, where the sort of mobile middle class, which had access to better resources, was demanding something that they considered to be better. And I'll come to that in a moment, because Geeta referred to good quality education, the implicit admission of the government that private sector provides good quality education. But there was this sort of movement away from the private schools, from the government schools, I beg your pardon. And over time, by the time we were looking at this in 2004 and 5, what had really happened was that the poor kids went to government schools, and anybody who could afford it went to a private school, whether that was a private recognized school or a private unrecognized school, that doesn't matter. They went to a private school. Worse, things like in Haryana, in states like Haryana, things like boys going to private schools because they were given preference over girls, and girls were continuing to go to government schools. So there was all of this happening as well. And the committee's view was that schools serve as institutions of socialization. And as institutions of socialization, whether they be in the private sector or in the public sector, they have a certain obligation to society as a whole. And that includes the private schools in this instance. And that's why that clause said that regardless of whether you actually receive any funding from government or not, so that clause is actually in two parts. The first part of it says that if you are receiving any kind of aid from government, then to the extent that you receive aid, to that same percentage, you will be liable to take in children from economically weaker sections. So if you're getting 50% of your costs as aid from government, then your student strength should be 50% evenly divided between those who are paying fees and those who are not, because you're already being paid for this. But even if you are not receiving any kind of aid from government, then as part of your social obligation to society, you need to take children in who come from diverse, different backgrounds. What's the kind of thing that happens in a fee charging private school? They have entry mechanisms. One of the things that the RTE Act does is it does away with entry mechanisms. It says you can't select children anymore. It'll all be by random choice. It'll be by a draw of lots. If schools select students, then they select according to a certain profile. So then the good schools pick up the cream. They end up doing very well, and then they continue to do well because they are doing that kind of cherry picking. The other schools don't do so well because they can't do this. So I think the Act needs to be seen not just in the terms of Section 12(1)(c), and there's a lot more. So, but I know we don't have the time. I would urge people to look at it not in terms of only Section 12(1)(c), but in terms of the overall Act itself. What was it trying to do? Now, the issues that we've been discussing are really about the fact that in implementation, it seems to have been distorted. And we've been watching it being implemented since 2009. And in the last 13 years, What has happened is that what was the intention, and that's why they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. What was the intention of the act and the way in which it's actually played out in different states, remembering always that what is true of Delhi is not true of Kerala, is not true of West Bengal, and so on. How it has played out in the states has been very different. Geeta referred to the fact that some states have even said that admission to private schools shall only be if there is no seat available in a government school. Now, to me, it seems like that state is actually trying to follow the intention of the act in the sense of saying government schools should be made available first. If they're not available, then we go to the private schools. One way of looking at it. Whether it's the right way or not, we don't know. The problem here lies in the fact that in a country like ours, which has the sort of diversity that we do, honestly speaking, with the benefit of having now worked on both sides of the table, having been involved with the policy making and implementing it in terms of running schools, I honestly believe that it is very hard for us to have a national act that can lay down for the entire country what system of education needs to be followed and how we should regulate both government as well as private schools. I continue to believe very firmly that there is a very strong role for private schools to play. I believe that private schools contribute to improving quality, but not necessarily in all cases. So again, when we talk about schools, it's always useful to look at the numbers. Broad order of magnitude, these are not exact numbers, but let's say there are 1.4 million schools in this country. Nearly 20% of them, give or take, are under private management. But of those schools, say, maybe 200,000, 250,000 schools that are under private management, the actual number of schools that are represented by the so-called schools that we're all familiar with, whether that's in Delhi, DPS and Vasant Valley, or City Montessori in Lucknow, or Millennium School, whatever, the so-called good schools, is probably 0.1% of that total 250,000. The remaining schools are a mixture. Some of them are excellent and struggle against all odds to deliver really good education, and some of them are terrible. And it's unfair for us to actually frame this debate in terms of a simple private versus public. This picture is also equally true on the government side. There are fabulous schools on the government side, and there are some terrible ones. And I think that's the key to this whole issue, that because there is so much diversity, not just in the country, but also in the school system, both on the public side and the private side, it becomes very difficult to frame any kind of regulation that is going to be relevant to the entire country. I think Anurag made a very valid point when he said that at the end of the day, this is a concurrent subject and the union has no business to be in this business. Possibly true. China's compulsory education law is one page, just one page. The rest of it is derived in the implementation by the provinces. And I think that is probably the way to go. We should agree that as a country, we believe that every child has a right to education, because that's where this was coming from. It's a rights. It was part of that whole rights-based approach that was taken by the UPA government. We believe that a child has a right to education, quality education. Now, how that has to be implemented, that should be left to the states. What role then in each state the private sector plays or the government sector plays, again, will evolve over time. The challenge with the RTE is not about the framing of the RTE, in my view. It is actually about the implementation of the RTE in different places. I know this only partially answers your question about whether there is agency for private schools, but if you look at it from the perspective that I'm just describing, which is that leave it to the states to figure out what the regulation and the governance should be, I think that's where you'll find the answer. I don't think anyone can give an answer either here or elsewhere about this is absolutely Formula 44 that will work. That's not possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kaushik. So I will take audience questions. There are a number of questions here. Yeah. So there are a number of questions on direct benefit transfer. I would like to modify that question of DBT to a question on e-rupee. So the government came up recently with this idea of e-rupee, and which has in fact the potential to plug some of the loopholes that exist with direct cash transfers or direct benefit transfers, because e-rupee is a digital tool, very similar to digital currency, but it's not cryptocurrency. It's of course a government voucher, and it would be a digital voucher, and it is a purpose specific and person specific voucher. So in that sense, why not switch to e-rupee for the purpose of reimbursement through the parent? And so in that sense, it would not be ex post transaction, it would be an ex ante transaction. So I would like to know your views on that. Open to all panelists.
Yeah, I'd like to say something on this. I think one of the things that, one of the fears of private schools in giving admission to children under the Right to Education Act is that if they accept reimbursement from government, it would be like a grant from government. It would be accepting money from government, and that will bring them under the Right to Information Act. And we all know that the Right to Information Act is used quite frequently to harass school and to blackmail schools and other entities. So a lot of private schools are very afraid to take reimbursements. I don't know to what extent in Delhi, when you were saying, Mr. Kundu, that 48% of schools didn't file their claims for a long period of time. And I just did wonder when you were saying that, whether part of it was due to a reluctance on the part of private schools to actually claim any reimbursement because of the fear that if they accept government reimbursement, they come under the Right to Information Act. If this reimbursement money, this intent of the government to reimburse the school for educating poor children, that is enshrined in the section 12.2 of the RTE Act, that could still be carried out through the DBT idea. And what Prashant just said regarding this particular digital tool being available, that seems to add to the feasibility of doing just such a thing. And when it comes to DBT in education, it's not unprecedented in India. Central government gives all its employees a children's education allowance, so-called, of rupees 2,250 rupees per month per child for up to 2 children for the express purpose of education. So that is a direct benefit transfer. And so the principle of a direct benefit transfer is already accepted. We also have the Amavodi program in I think it's in Andhra Pradesh. So I think that some of these, I think that the DBT idea is a promising one to look at if we want to encourage private schools to take, to admit children under the Act.
Thank you, Professor Kingdon. Mr. Kaushik.
Thanks, Prashant. I think the other concern, I just wanted to add to something that Geeta was saying. The other concern is not so much the RTI as it is about the business of being audited as well. The moment you take in government funding, you become also liable to be audited by the CNAG, because at the end of the day, you're talking about public funds, and therefore there is a fiscal responsibility, that a fiduciary responsibility that the government has where public funding is concerned. But on the question of DBT, I wonder how you would ensure that the money that you give a parent is actually used for education, or that the money you give a parent who has 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls, is actually used equitably between all of them and doesn't end up going only to the boy. Central government does give money to its employees, but central government takes no account from its employees of what happened to that money, and has no way of actually finding out what happened to that 30,000 rupees or 28,000 rupees, whatever it is, every year. So the challenge with DBT is not that transferring the money would be the issue, because we've already seen that with LPG and so many other subsidies that are now being directly transferred. The challenge is in ensuring that that money actually ends up being used for the purpose for which it's being given.
Thank you, Mr. Kaushik. Madhuri?
Yeah, so I completely agree with what Amit was saying right now. That's something that we've recognized as a concern as well in our work of, will that money really be utilized? Because parents have a competing commitment at home, which might take precedence. Another point to this, in terms of another argument for why parents should not possibly be given the money, has been that schools then have no responsibility in ensuring that free education is provided to children. And the amount that is provided may not be enough or may not be sufficient for parents to make do for tuition costs, transportation, books, uniform. As we were discussing, they may not be enough for private schools either, but they are definitely not going to be sufficient for the parent. And that might end up leading to more dropouts, or leading to the parents being unable to sustain their children's education. So that's another reason. And there are again a couple of judgments. So you can see the Bilaspur High Court judgment states explicitly that parents should not be given money for these very reasons, that they're not sure where it will be spent, and also that the school would then have no responsibility.
Can I come in
Sorry,
here?
Prashant, sorry, Anurag, just round that out. Can I just add one more point to what Madhuri was just saying? And that's that, essentially what we're talking about here is a voucher scheme. What we're saying is, let's hand over a voucher to the parents, which is then fungible. They can use it in any school that they so choose. And even though I've served on the board of CCS for many, many, many years, this was one item that on which we were unable to reach any kind of agreement. And I must say, CCS was kind enough to say that we'll agree to disagree on this one. There are studies that show that vouchers work, but there are also an equal number of studies that show you that even when poor parents had full information, what is the issue with a voucher? You give a voucher to somebody. You need to make sure also that that person has absolutely complete and up-to-date information about the competing choices available for that voucher. And there is always going to be information asymmetry, especially in a country like ours. There are studies that showed in Chile, which has had the first and most successful voucher scheme running for years together, which was forced through over all kinds of objections from the teachers' unions. Even there were studies that showed that when poor parents were given full information asymmetry was removed, they were given a voucher, they still chose not to go to certain schools because they believed that those schools were not for them or their kind. They were meant for other people. So a voucher or a DBT isn't necessarily the golden bullet here. That's all I'm saying. It may work under certain circumstances. I am not sure at this point what those circumstances might be. But simply saying that we should just transfer the money to the parents and let them take a call and let them spend it on education, that may not be a very efficient solution. It may end up causing more problems than the present system.
Anurag, you have a point?
So I mean, clearly 3 different concerns shown. I don't think I agree with any of them, actually. I have a very different concern. I don't agree with what Madhuri earlier said about being unsure of money being given to parents, or the High Court similar observation. With respect to the High Court has no business determining policies. Its job is to adjudicate the legality of a statute, and then wherever the rights are infringed, intervene. Having said that, there's incredible evidence now, both anecdotal, observational, and empirical, that parents do value education. In fact, at the first instance of little bit of money coming in, parents are flocking to the budget private schools, which indicates that parents are going to resort to getting the children educated at great cost and at great hard work. So that part, at least in my mind, is settled. The second concern about the boy and girl, I don't think the voucher system or the direct benefit transfer is adding to the problem. It will continue with the existing problem, because if I'm not willing to educate my girl child using the voucher/DBT, then I'm also unlikely to get my girl child applied under EWS-DG quota in the current format. So in that sense, no extra level of inequity is introduced. It just perpetuates the existing ones. So just one model is not necessarily better than the other model as far as this is concerned, or worse off. The third concern, I share a very different concern here, which is that if the money is transferred, let's say I am that parent who would have otherwise gotten admission under the section 12(1)(c) through the force of the law, and now instead the government is giving me, let's say, 30,000 rupees of cash and saying, go get admission in any private school of your choice. There's a few problems. One, a DPS, for example, or the likes of DPS, is unlikely to give me admission on 30,000 because I simply can't afford it. Now, if I cannot enter the top income private schools, the very intent of the legislation, which is to make classroom homogeneous, gets defeated. Now, I cannot be entering the likes of DPS at 30,000. So with the intent defeated, there is no reason for me to shift from model A to model B. I will shift to model B only if my intent is honored. Now, the intent is not being honored. So that's my first concern. The second concern is what Amit said. The force of the law is a very different form of empowerment, or it emboldens us differently. When the law says you cannot slap me, I know that you cannot slap me. Vis-a-vis, a direct benefit transfer or a voucher does not come with the force of the law. It does give you the same financial, statistically speaking, the same amount in your bank account vis-a-vis a voucher, vis-a-vis with the force of law and the money going to the, but just the empowerment with which one is likely to feel, and it's a hypothesis, and I could very well be wrong, but it's, only an empirical study, if there hasn't been already one, would reveal. But my hypothesis is it's a very different form of empowerment. So that's my concern with direct benefit transfer or voucher.
Okay, I would let Dr. Kingdon have the last word.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just wanted to contribute to this very interesting question about the desirability of using a direct benefit transfer or voucher for getting children who are from disadvantaged or economically weaker section homes to access, the kinds of schools that they would like to access. So I think that the first objection that's been raised is about the fungibility of the money that is given. This has been a very long-standing concern, not just about DBT in the context of school education, but DBT in other contexts as well. But if you look at the evidence, for instance, in Bihar, the same kind of point was raised about when the Nitish Kumar government wanted to give bicycles for secondary education. But what we understand is that 95% of the people used it for the purpose for which it was given. So I think that, there's also something problematic about the state having this rather paternalistic attitude that it has the interests of the children more at heart than the parents themselves would. There may well be a certain proportion of children, a certain proportion of parents who would use it for other purposes. But I think a good proportion of children, parents might well use it from existing studies, and not just in India, in other places as well, in Bangladesh as well, in many other countries, DBTs have been used for a whole variety of transfers. The second objection is regarding the point that Mr. Kundu was making, that a DPS may not give admission. See, you've got to look at what the counterfactual is. You cannot have nirvana. There's no single policy bullet through which you can reach perfect equality and absolute access. But if compared to where a person is at the moment, somebody who does a who's a hawker on the street, if his child can go to a school that costs 30,000 a year, which it's beyond his wildest dreams. So we at least let's do that. We cannot imagine that there can be this complete equality, because when we try and do that, you can see the problems that arise. You can see the problems in the implementation of the extremely well-intentioned Right to Education Act. So I think that we have to accept some compromise, and I'm saying that you may not get complete equality, but it is much better than the current counterfactual, the current situation, which is the counterfactual. And I mean, I accept the point that, yes, if you give it its DBT, it doesn't come with the force of the law. But the point is that, again, it again goes back to the point about the fungibility. If it doesn't come with the force of the law, you will not make it justiciable, perhaps. But, you know, it has been made an obligation on parents to educate their children. Not that anybody who has actually gone and prosecuted parents who don't educate their children despite the availability of free education. But I mean, I accept that point, but I think that that's not a showstopper. I feel that, you know, if the DBT has the potential to really, you know, expand children's opportunity, then let's use it without necessarily believing it to be the panacea that we would all like.
Thank you, Dr. Kingan. Thank you so much. I would like to thank all the panelists. I think this was a great discussion, and I hope the audience also enjoyed the discussion.